Good evening, everyone. Distinguished guests, my dear friends, Czech and Slovak compatriots. They always say that diplomats should be really short. They should keep, speeches short, so I'll be really short. I just wanted to say hello, and then I'm both honored and thrilled to kick off, to inaugurate the very first annual lecture, which has been born thanks to Eva, Pavla, and probably me as well, some time ago. And we jointly would love to bring you the best lectures focused on Jewish history. That's why we brought some financial resources and just keep us in your minds. And definitely we're gonna bring the cream of the cream from the Czech, probably Slovak Republic. So thanks to Jewish Museum in Prague, History of Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews, and Consulate General of the Czech Republic, you can hear today's lecture, and Dr. Žonca will be really excited. I'm so surprised that Hussites were somehow influenced by Jewish medieval Bohemia, and I'm really looking forward to that. So, enjoy the evening. That's pretty much it, and I believe, I was really short. Thank you.
So before I will ask Professor Milan Žonca to the microphone, Pavla Niklová, the director of the Jewish Museum in Prague, will introduce a speaker, tell us a bit about the Jewish Museum in Prague, and about the annual lectures project. This project is her brainchild.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled to be back and to be representing two organizations that have been really close to my heart, the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews and now the Jewish Museum in Prague. And so before I introduce Milan Žonca, I will steal like a few minutes of his precious and your time. And I would like to tell you very briefly about what's going on at the Jewish Museum, particularly about things that you can't see if you come to visit, which I hope that all of you will, and you will be most welcome. So, as you probably know, the Jewish Museum is the third oldest, the Jewish Museum in Prague is the third oldest Jewish museum in the world, with a huge collection of about 45,000 Judaica and other things. Of course, most of them got to the museum during the war, so the institution is really special in the way that strived to save this precious heritage and legacy. And so if you visit the museum these days, you could see exhibitions and buildings. You could visit 4 synagogues and the old Jewish cemetery. What these days you can't visit are 2 buildings that we closed down in June because the exhibitions that were placed in them were 30 years old. And so we had to do it simply for the fact that really the standard life for a permanent exhibition or a long-term exhibition should be around 20 years. So this was actually overdue. And it's one of the big projects that we are working on now. And it's an adventure, because we had to close them down a little bit suddenly. We didn't have the projects ready, what's going to be new in those 2 buildings. And and in a way, it's an incredible process because the buildings themselves sort of start asking for particular things, and so it makes us changing our original plans, and it's a wonderful hard work, but it's a work in progress. And so I will start with the hlhausen synagogue, which we closed in June. As you see, it's currently the largest synagogue in Prague. There are some old photos, one of them from 1942. That was the year when the last service was held there. And ever since, the synagogue served for the Jewish Museum, so there were exhibitions. There were exhibitions also during the war. Oh, and here you can see it's the only synagogue that has Baroque or ornamentation and decoration in the ceiling. This is from the war, where those courageous Jewish curators who kept working during the war there prepared 2 exhibitions actually during the war. And also after the war, again, there were new exhibitions, more or less all of them dedicated to Jewish customs and traditions. This is already happier time from different sides. Then in the 90s, when the Jewish Museum was returned back to the Jewish community, again, a new exhibition on Jewish customs and traditions was opened, and that was in the synagogue until this June. So you see all those heavy wooden cases. Basically, some people who visited the place were telling me this is the exhibition of the 19th century, and they were a little bit right. And then we moved the things out, and now the place is empty again. The gallery that you see here was added at the end of the 19th century because the community was so big that it couldn't accommodate everyone. And at the moment, we hope that we will be able to raise money and to come with a solid project when we could use the gallery for a new permanent exhibition again, but hopefully much more contemporary. And our ambitious plan is to use the main space for temporary exhibitions, with having the Aron always at the backdrop. So we will see how that goes. And actually, this fall I was approached by Jewish Reform congregation in Prague at Chaim that the number of their members have been growing, and so they were looking for a place for Yom Kippur. And I said, well, we don't have a synagogue ready, but then I was thinking about this empty place, and they really loved it. And so there was first service since 1942 for Yom Kippur, and it had an incredible atmosphere. And I even was honored to lit one of their electric candles. The second building that I'd like to show you that you can't see right now is the ceremonial hall. It looks old, but it's actually the newest building of the whole Jewish Museum. It was built at the beginning of the 20th century, so that means already during the time when the old ghetto was being demolished and those new Art Nouveau buildings, basically gentrification was taking place there. And although the old Jewish cemetery wasn't used for a few centuries, people still felt necessity or need to have burials burial place or ceremonial hall in the center. But it wasn't used for long. It was used for like 8 years. And since 1926, again, it became part of the Jewish Museum. So here are a few photos from its history again. Yeah, that was already during the communist time when the museum was run and owned by the state. This is what it looks these days. And this exhibition was there till this June. And now it looks like this. And again, we have this plan is much more concrete now. We hope to open it in the fall of 2026, when the museum will celebrate already its 120 years. We hope that people, we want to restore it as much as we can to its original look. So that means we will clean the mosaic floor and the paintings, and just hope that people could enjoy the purpose, what it was built for. People will be able to learn about the urban renovation of the city, why the Jewish Museum was established, and also learn about current Jewish community, that it's alive, and that this part is also part of the house of life of the whole journey. So if you'd like to find out more, never hesitate to contact us. I hope all of you will visit the Jewish Museum. Especially you can plan your trip for 2026, when we will have a lot of events going on for the anniversary, and we just hope to be an open place both for the Jewish community and for any visitors that come to Prague. So please be back. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Also, I would like to say that the purpose of this new project of the annual lecture is, of course, to promote Jewish history and culture that has been happening in Central Europe. When we had an open call for this lecture, we received about 26 applications, really from researchers, academics from all over the world. And so the purpose is not only to promote the Jewish Museum and this history, but also to learn how many people actually are interested in this small part of history in this particular territory. And so Milan Žonca is a lecturer in Hebrew and Jewish Studies at the Faculty of Arts, Charles University, where he currently also serves as the Vice Dean for International Relations. He received his doctorate from Queen Mary in University of London and previously held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences. His research interests include the cultural and intellectual history of Jews in the late Middle Ages, especially in Central Europe, and medieval Jewish Christian polemics. And the last thing is that we have small refreshments for you and a glass of wine, so please don't leave us, stay for Q&As and then join us in the library. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. It's an honor to be here tonight to deliver this inaugural lecture on the history and culture of the Jews in the Czech and Slovak lands. And I want to express my gratitude to the Jewish Museum in Prague and to the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews for this opportunity, as well as to the Consulate General of the Czech Republic in New York and to the Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association for their generous hospitality. In early 15th century Prague, amid heated debates about church reform stimulated by a decades-long papal schism, a distinctive religious movement emerged in Prague under the leadership of Jan Hus, a university scholar and an influential preacher. His understanding of the church and the critique of its practices gained substantial support among Bohemian clergy, nobles and townspeople. Following Huss's execution for heresy at the Council of Constance in 1415, and particularly after the death of King Wenceslas IV in 1419, tensions escalated in Bohemia, erupting into the conflicts known as the Hussite Wars. The movement articulated its demands in the 4 Articles of Prague of 1420, with Utrechtwism, communion in both kinds, bread and wine for laity, becoming its most visible symbol. Between 1420 and 1434, 4 unsuccessful crusades against the Hussites took place. Eventually, the Catholic Church accepted a compromise with the Hussites, which led to the official acceptance of Utrechtwism as local religious practice in Bohemia. These Hussite wars fundamentally transformed Bohemian society, establishing a distinctive religious culture that would persist well into the early modern period. Beyond Utrechtwism, broader questions about ecclesiastical authority, the authority of the church, scriptural interpretation, and the nature of the church played an important role in the movement's intellectual profile. Different interpretations of these theological principles gradually led to divisions between moderate Utrechtwists and radical Taborites, reflecting deeper social and political tensions within the Bohemian society. The movement's emphasis on biblical authority manifested in an active program of Czech translations and public preaching, with the aim of making God's word accessible to wider audiences. This attitude helped foster a characteristic intellectual culture that bridged Latin scholastic discourse with vernacular religious instruction. While these religious and social transformations profoundly affected the Bohemian society, their impact on the local Jewish community remains disputed. Prague hosted an important Jewish settlement, likely established already in the 10th century. By the mid-12th century, scholars from Prague were studying at Talmudic academies in Germany and northern France. Surviving glosses to rabbinic texts from Bohemia indicate that these scholars were familiar with the local vernacular, the Old Czech, suggesting their integration into the local culture. Assuming this integration persisted into the 14th and 15th centuries, it raises 2 critical questions, which I would like to explore in this lecture. Were the Jews of Prague aware of the religious debates taking place among their Christian neighbors? And if so, did they engage with these discussions? At least one contemporary Hebrew source suggests a positive answer to this question. A text entitled the Hussite Chronicle, or Gilgul Bnei Chushim in Hebrew, contains a passage that suggests a very close connection between the emergent Hussite movement and the Jewish inhabitants of Prague. This text was written by Zalman of St. Goar, a student of the famous 15th century Rabbi Jacob Milan, or Maharil. In the Chronicle, Zalman portrays Rabbi Avigdor Kara, a Jewish scholar living in Prague at the turn of the 15th century, as a close friend of King Wenceslas IV, and claims Kara even had influence on Jan Hus himself. A great thing happened thanks to Rabbi Avigdor Kara from the royal city Prague in the land of Bohemia. The king of the land took a liking to Kara, and he loved him like the apple of his eye. And so it happened that Kara studied with the king until he, the king, acknowledged the principle of unity and uniqueness of the Holy One, blessed be he, and believed in it. Kara therefore composed hymns and poems in the holy language, that is, in Hebrew, and also in the language of Bohemia, which were sung publicly and proclaimed that there is no faith like the faith of Israel. Shortly afterwards, the king passed away. There arose after him a priest named Hus, which in the Czech language means goose. To this day, his followers are known as Hussites. And this priest would gather all the inhabitants of the city of Prague and preach to them and teach them until they all believed in God's unity. They then arose and destroyed all their houses of idolatry, that is, the churches, and their idols they committed to the flames. And the priests who persisted in cleaving to the faith of Jesus, they put to death. And the Hussites were joined by the majority of the land. The text highlights two key aspects of Kara's activities: his educational engagement at the royal court and his composition of liturgical poetry. Similar roles are echoed in the inscription on Kara's gravestone, the oldest surviving in Prague's Old Town Jewish Cemetery, which commemorates him as, quote, a man who could understand pleasant song and who studied the Torah in public and privately, end of quote. Yet scholars have questioned the authenticity of the reported friendship between Kara and the king. Far from being a wealthy financier who might be welcomed at the royal court, Kara began his career as a humble schoolteacher, a vocation considered less prestigious than the path of a Talmudic scholar. Having survived an attack on the Jewish community in Prague in 1389, Kara was even forced to solicit financial aid through letters sent to neighboring Jewish communities. However, there is some indirect evidence confirming Kara's connection to the royal court. This evidence is found in a manuscript now in the University Library in Cambridge, which was copied from a manuscript model belonging to Kara himself. In addition to other philosophical and grammatical texts, the manuscript contains a fragment of the Hebrew translation of one of the few medieval bestsellers, the encyclopedic mirror for princes called The Secret of Secrets, or Secretum Secretorum in Latin, which was believed to have been written by Aristotle for Alexander the Great. The fragment in question is a diagram, also known as the Circle of Justice. It consists of a circle divided into 8 sections, containing a series of concatenated definitions. Quote, the world is a garden hedged in by kingship. The kingship is authority kept alive by religion. The religion is a custom preserved by a king. The king is a shepherd gathering the army. The army are helpless, fed by money. Money is prey gathered by the masses. The masses are servants subjected to justice. Justice is happiness, and it repairs the world. It remains unclear whether this diagram explaining to a mighty ruler the mechanisms by which human society operates was part of the original manuscript, which was owned by Kara, or whether it's a later edition. But if it was indeed included, it would reflect Kara's interest in questions of governance, perhaps influenced by his association with the court of Wenceslas IV. Moreover, Kara would not be the only Jew at the court of Wenceslas. The king faced frequent criticism as a, quote, Jew lover from his contemporaries, most notably from his bitter rival, Archbishop John of Gladstein, who complained that, quote, one Jew has more power among the princes than a nobleman or a prelate, end of quote. Gladstein also accused Wenceslas's vice-chancellor, Sigismund Huller, of maintaining close connections with the local Jewish community and actively assisting in the reversion of Jews who had been forcibly baptized. Jenstein's polemical language was undoubtedly shaped by his ongoing power struggle with the king. But there is evidence that it was not entirely unfounded. In 1417, near the end of his life, King Wenceslas rewarded Kara's next-door neighbor, a Jew named Pfeifel, described in the sources as, quote, a traveler and surgeon from the holy city of Jerusalem, end of quote, for his, quote, faithful service in medicine and also a secret message, end of quote. The nature of the secret message, however, remains unfortunately undisclosed. Kara's royal connection remains far from established. Yet the Hussite Chronicle, despite all its rhetorical flourish, offers important insights into Jewish-Christian interactions in and around Prague. According to the narrative, Kara used poetry to promote specific theological ideas, particularly the importance of God's oneness. As we shall see, attempts to promote a philosophical understanding of Judaism and to communicate both internally and externally an image of Jewish faith as superior to Christianity were genuine aspects of Jewish intellectual life at the turn of the 15th century. Moreover, the close physical proximity of Jewish and Christian populations created an environment where both communities engaged with similar concerns about popular religious practices. In what follows, I'm going to offer a series of vignettes that will hopefully illustrate these parallel developments. The city's urban layout shaped the daily lives and interactions of its inhabitants, fostering both connection and conflict. Let us now turn to the spatial and social environment of Prague to explore how physical closeness influenced these complex relationships. The exact location of the Prague's Jewish settlement in its early history is unclear, and it may have shifted over time. It is likely, but not certain, that the oldest focal point of the Jewish settlement within the Prague's old town was located in the vicinity of the Old Synagogue, which is mentioned around the year 1142. In the mid-13th century, the so-called New, known today as the Old New Synagogue, was established. The two synagogues and the adjacent Jewish houses were separated by a block of Christian houses, and from the mid-14th century by the Benedictine nunnery of the Holy Spirit. By the last quarter of the 14th century, the Jewish community of Prague was protected by a system of 6 gates, which remained closed on the Sabbath and Jewish holidays. However, despite these gates, the Jewish quarter was not a separate district. It was located within the city's intricate network of no less than 45 parishes. The areas inhabited by the Jews fell within the St. Valentine's, St. Nicholas, and Holy Cross the Greater parishes. According to the visitation report of Archdeacon Pavla of Janovice, who visited these parishes between 1379 and 1382, priests from both St. Valentine's and Holy Cross churches complained that the Jews refused to compensate them for payments they would otherwise have received from Christians. This dispute reveals one facet of the complex entanglement of Jewish and Christian spaces. Municipal tax records show that the core of the Jewish quarter was surrounded by several blocks of houses inhabited by a heterogeneous population. Alexander Putík estimated that there were around 79 houses in the Jewish quarter during the late 14th to early 15th centuries, of which 65 were inhabited by Jews. In other words, out of the estimated 900 inhabitants of the so-called Jewish town, in the 1380s, some 150 were Christians. The Christian population consisted primarily of ordinary Christian craftsmen and tradesmen. Notably, the same groups were the most frequent recipients of small Jewish loans. It was a rough neighborhood, notorious for gambling and prostitution. A St. Nicholas parishioner complained to Pavel of Janovice that many houses in the area were inhabited by students, who often accommodated prostitutes, which, quote, is a source of scandal for many, end of quote. He further reported that, quote, often people die without having received the sacraments because the priests refused to visit them, presumably out of fear for their own safety. This specific concern about the ambivalent character of the neighborhood was transformed into an anti-Jewish stereotype in contemporary literary texts that sought to explain the major attack on the Jewish community in Prague during the Easter Vigil of 1389. This violent outbreak, which claimed the lives of most of Prague's 750 Jewish inhabitants, interrupted a period of flourishing that the community experienced under the rule of Charles IV and his son Wenceslas. Through the Hebrew elegy titled All Those Afflictions, composed by none other than Avigdor Kara, whom we have just met, and recited for centuries during the annual commemoration liturgy of the attack on the day after Passover, the event became deeply embedded in local communal memory. But in contemporary Christian narratives, such as the Latin liturgical parody titled The Passion of the Jews of Prague, the Jews are portrayed as triggering the riot by attacking a priest who was passing through the Jewish quarter with a consecrated host while bringing the communion to a sick person. In these accounts, Jews are depicted asserting the boundaries of their neighborhood through blasphemy and the throwing of stones. The spatial and social proximity of Jews and Christians of all classes concerned Prague theologians. Matthew of Krakow, a master of theology at the University of Prague, addressed this issue before 1400 in a response to a query sent by one of his close friends, possibly Archbishop John of Jenstein, who expressed concern about the contact between Christian butchers and Jews. Matthew listed numerous established reasons why a good Christian should avoid business dealings and social contact with the Jews, citing both their supposed negative influence on Christian morality and their alleged enmity for the Christian faith. This unambiguous anti-Jewish position seems to address the situation on the ground, which included uncomfortably intimate contact between Jews and Christians. It is reasonable to assume that in the urban environment just described, Jews have also been exposed to ideas circulated by Christian preachers from the pulpit. Activities of the Austrian Augustinian preacher Konrad Waldhauser earlier in the 1360s will serve as a good example. Waldhauser was first invited to Prague and preached several sermons there during the Easter season of 1363. In response to the great success of these sermons among the German inhabitants of Prague, Waldhauser received a benefice in the wealthy Church of Our Lady Befortine in Prague, which enabled him to dedicate all his energies to public preaching. His sermons attracted masses of listeners, and he continued to preach in Prague and elsewhere until his death in 1369. In one of his writings, Waldhauser mentioned that many Jews, both men and women, visited his sermons, quote, sitting and standing manifestly among Christians, end of quote. And when some of his Christian listeners expressed concerns about Jewish presence at his sermons, and even tried to bar the Jews from attending them, Waldhauser allegedly explained Jewish participation as a sign of the approaching universal conversion of the Jews on the eve of the apocalypse. It is rather unlikely that Waldhauser's Jewish listeners were attracted to his theological message. His moral exhortations could have resonated with their critical perceptions of Christian society. Nevertheless, it is more likely that it was primarily the theatrical aspect of his activity, the sense of spectacle, that drew the Jewish inhabitants of Prague near or perhaps even into the old town churches. However, their interest in Waldhauser's activity was facilitated by the permeable spatial boundaries between Jewish and Christian communities of Prague. Beyond the physical proximity and complex social interactions between Jews and Christians, evaluating the contours of Jewish awareness of the Hussite program of church reform requires us to consider the local Jewish community's engagement with the study of philosophy. The period leading up to the Hussite reform movement coincided with significant developments in Prague's intellectual life. From mid-14th century onwards, Jewish scholars in Prague embarked on an intellectual journey that set them apart from their co-religionists. Their circle included most notably Menaḥem Shalem and Yom Tov Lipman Mu, two scholars who served alongside Avigdor Kara, whom I've mentioned, as members of the local rabbinic court, as attested by their signatures on a divorce document from 1413. Shalem, Kara, and hlhausen sought to enhance the traditional curriculum of Jewish texts by turning their attention to philosophical works that were rarely studied in Ashkenazi communities of Central and Eastern Europe. At the heart of their study was perhaps the most influential work of medieval Jewish philosophy, The Guide of the Perplexed, written by Maimonides. The main purpose of Maimonides' work was to harmonize traditional Jewish biblical interpretation with Aristotelian philosophy. Inspired by this aim, some of these Prague scholars expanded their philosophical study to include Hebrew translations of the works of Aristotle himself and of his Arabic interpreters. In their surviving glosses and texts, they often refer to each other, suggesting that they were engaged in philosophical study together. However, each of them approached this activity with their specific emphases. Among these three scholars, Menaḥem ben Jacob Shalem was perhaps the most advanced student of Aristotelian philosophy. He left behind glosses on the Guide of the Perplexed, as well as other philosophical fragments. Shalem believed that philosophical study was a path to personal salvation through the acquisition of metaphysical knowledge. This knowledge, he argued, would survive bodily death through unification with God, whom he conceptualized as the Aristotelian active intellect. Moreover, Shalem maintained that combining philosophical study with physical mortification and strict ascetic practices offered the surest path to achieving communion with the divine already during one's lifetime, thus securing protection against bodily harm. While Shalem followed Maimonides in regarding philosophy as an esoteric pursuit, requiring gradual and systematic initiation, accessible only to a chosen few, he committed himself to popularizing the correct interpretation of anthropomorphic references to God, found in the Bible and traditional Jewish literature. Medieval Jewish philosophers considered the attribution of physical characteristics to God as deeply problematic, because this would compromise the fundamental doctrine of divine unity and incorporeality. The challenge of reconciling traditional biblical language with philosophical methodology became a defining feature of the debates between Jewish advocates and opponents of Aristotelian philosophy in Southern Europe. Prague scholars transplanted this concern into their own Ashkenazic milieu. This intellectual tension is illustrated by an exchange between Menaḥem Shalem and one of the leading rabbis in Austria, Abraham Klausner. Klausner approached Shalem in writing, seeking guidance on interpreting divine attributes and the prophetic visions in the Bible. In his request, Klausner admitted his difficulties, quote, "It is difficult for me to understand, study, and read philosophical books, for they disagree with one another. One says this, the other says something else, And I don't know which opinion is correct, the former, the latter, or perhaps they are both equally good. End of quote. Shalem responded by explaining Maimonides' basic position on the subject, but he also made it clear that Klausner need not trouble himself with philosophical intricacies. The correct interpretation of anthropomorphism was important also for Yom Tov Lipman Mu, perhaps the best-known member of the Prague philosophical circle. Lipman achieved prominence through his popular and influential treatise Sefer HaNitzachon, or the Book of Polemic, pictured here in one of the early modern printings. This compendium of polemical arguments was directed not only against Christians, but also against all heretics who deny 13 basic theological principles of Jewish faith, as formulated by Maimonides. Lipman also wrote a special treatise titled The Intention of Prayer, dedicated to the subject of interpretation of bodily expressions in traditional Jewish texts, particularly liturgical prayers. Finally, Avigdor Kara was also deeply engaged in promoting a philosophical understanding of the Jewish faith. He corresponded with scholars from other regions, notably Shimon ben Shmuel of Regensburg, to discuss the correct approaches to harmonizing philosophy with the esoteric knowledge of Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalah. Like Lipman, Kara's popularizing efforts extended beyond the narrow circles of initiated scholars. As suggested by the Hussite Chronicle, Kara wrote poems listing Maimonides' articles of faith in rhymed form, both in Hebrew and in the vernacular, to be recited during synagogue liturgy. One of his most well-known poems, One Alone Unique is God, affirms God's oneness and incorporeality while proclaiming the superiority of the Jewish faith. Quote, "The mystery of faith is nowhere found except among the Hebrews. Forbidden altars shall lie upon the ground. Hallelujah." End of quote. In a strikingly polemical rhetorical move, Kara directly addressed Christians and Muslims to disprove the anthropomorphic conception of God. Quote, "Jew, Christian, Arab, understand, God has no form that can be seen. His ways are just, and him we trust. Hallelujah. He has no body, blood, or flesh, nor into human power was he delivered. So do the 12 tribes believe. Hallelujah." End of quote. Kara's verses not only reflect the philosophically informed objections of Prague Jewish scholars to anthropomorphism in the Jewish culture, but also serve as a polemical challenge to Christian religious ideas. I believe that such strategies, which combine internal intellectual developments with polemical concerns, were fostered by the religious context of Prague in the years leading up to the Hussite movement. To further explore how Jewish intellectual responses intersected with Christian theological debates, I will now turn to Yom Tov Lipman Mu's Sefer HaNitzachon, examining how this work directly engages with the religious tensions of the time. In the last chapters of his polemical work, Lipman describes a public disputation he had with a Jewish convert to Christianity named Peter, formerly known as Pesach. The debate was part of the proceedings after the Jews were arrested as a result of the charges brought forward by the convert. According to Lipman's narrative, the arrest occurred in August 1399, and despite the rabbi's best efforts, 77 Jews were murdered and an additional 3 burned at the stake 1 year later. The context in which the incident took place is uncertain. While some scholars have assumed that the debate may have occurred in Prague, this seems unlikely. Although inquisitorial investigations of Waldensian heresy are documented in Prague towards the end of the 14th century, there are no indications of similar proceedings involving the Jewish community that would culminate in such a major trial. I believe that the events are more likely connected with a host desecration accusation, which took place in Poznań, a city just under 300 miles to the northeast from Prague, in today's Poland, in summer 1399. And I'm not going to go into details, but I'm happy to discuss the evidence for this identification during the question period. In any case, internal evidence suggests that Lipman's description of the event was likely composed and incorporated into the Sefer Nitzachon during his stay in Prague. And I believe it is reasonable to assume that his argument, as expressed in Sefer HaNitzachon, was shaped by the local religious landscape. According to Lipman, Peter accused Jews of incorporating offensive references to Christianity and Christians in their liturgical prayers. Peter said, in the prayer called Aleinu Leshabeach, it is our duty to praise, you say, the Gentiles worship vanity and emptiness, and the numerical value of the Hebrew words and emptiness is the same as the value of the word Yeshu, that is, Jesus. End of quote. In his reply, Lipman argued that the prayer did not in fact refer to Christianity in itself, but rather to the veneration of images of saints by uneducated villagers who believe that the images themselves have some divine substance. I replied, don't you admit that those wooden and stone images that you worship are made only as a likeness and they have no divine substance? And don't you admit that there are women, children, and villagers who do not know that they are only a likeness and think that they have some substance of your divinity? And he was forced to acknowledge this. I said, you have now acknowledged everything we say in Aleinu Leshabeach, for we do not simply say, who has not made us like the nations. Rather, we say, who has not made us like the nations of the lands, nor placed us like the families of the earth. These are the villages that do not dwell in the cities, but live on the land without fortifications. And they are the families that work the land. These do not know anything and think that those images are your Godhead. And this is great evil, as it is said in the book of Isaiah, and they pray to a God who cannot save. These images are the source of this error, as I have just explained. Here, Lipman reinterpreted a polemical passage in a Jewish liturgical text not as a criticism not of Christian religion per se, but rather of a specific type of Christian religious practice. He cleverly diverted the attack of his opponent from the focus on Jewish anti-Christian rhetoric towards an issue that was perceived as problematic also in the theological debates taking place in late medieval Bohemia. Physical matter, be it in form of images, liturgical objects, or relics of saints, played a crucial role in late medieval spirituality. Contemporary theological discourse frequently addressed its role in worship and its ambivalent relationship to the divine. In Bohemia, the cult of images and relics flourished during the reign of Charles IV. The emperor collected relics from across Europe, housing them both in the treasury of St. Vitus Cathedral and various churches, various parish churches throughout Prague. Moreover, he promoted the newly acquired relics through diverse artistic media and secured papal approval for new feast days dedicated to their public display. In this way, Charles IV transformed Prague's religious landscape, turning the imperial capital into a major pilgrimage center. However, this practice was strongly critiqued by Reform preachers from the 1380s onwards. One of the first and most influential critics of image veneration was Lipman's contemporary, Maciej or Matthias of Janov. a graduate of the University of Paris, who later became a canon of the cathedral chapter in Prague, Matěj was also one of the first champions of heightened devotion for the Eucharist. Matěj's ideas profoundly shaped the later Bohemian Reformation and the Hussite movement, particularly influencing important Hussite theologians such as Mikuláš of Dresden and Jakubek of Stříbro. Matěj discussed popular abuses associated with image veneration in his major work titled Rules of the Old and the New Testament, written between 1387 and 1393. In this text, Matěj presented an apocalyptic interpretation of the vices widespread in contemporary church. In his view, clerical corruption, avarice, and lax devotion were all signs of the coming of the Antichrist. He also proposed an appropriate remedy, namely heightened Eucharistic devotion, including frequent lay communion. Eucharistic devotion is also crucial for Matěj's discussion of the problems associated with the veneration of images. Matěj argued that anything which distracts from full adoration of the sacrament should be removed from the church. He criticized the cult of images and statues fueled by priestly avarice and claimed that it is in fact a tool used by the devil and the Antichrist to lead the faithful away from true worship. Even the miracles allegedly produced by certain venerated statues and images could be, in his view, the work of the devil. To provide an example, Matěj referred to a superstitious belief that certain ancient images contain some sort of divine presence. And this is the source of the error, which is believed and disseminated by some people, that an image of Christ or such like contains a certain power as soon as it reaches the age of 30 years, and that divinity is present in it. Then certain omens and rumors regarding miracles brought about by these images are added to this. Signs of such omens and miracles are multiplied, and doubtful memorials appear all around in great number. They draw the people of God neither to the faith of Lord Jesus Christ, nor to charity, nor to hope in Jesus Christ alone, but they attract carnal people and lead them towards alien belief and stupid reverence of such statues, so that they put their love and confidence in them. End of quote. In the light of such abuses, Matěj claimed it is no wonder that some Jews think that Christians venerate gold and wood and not God, and turn Christian religion into an object of ridicule. The above-mentioned proclamations and doctrine, namely that such statues or images are to be venerated by the same kind of worship and adoration as God himself, scandalize the Jews completely needlessly and bring the faith in Christ into derision among them. The Jews laugh and affirm that we Christians have in our temples gods made of wood and stone, venerate them and worship them. End of quote. However, Matěj did not place blame solely on the popular religious practices of uneducated Christians. His sharp criticism was also directed at Christian religious authorities who permitted excessive image worship to continue. This critique was almost certainly directed at Prague's ecclesiastical establishment, which had opposed his public preaching. The conflict between Matěj and the local church intensified in 1388, when Prague's Synod of Vicars General formally defended image worship, affirming both the right to pray to images and the legitimacy of miracles attributed to them. The conflict then escalated in 1389, when the Synod compelled Matěj to revoke his views on both image worship and the frequent communion, and restricted his preaching activities to his parish church far away in western Bohemia. Although Matěj himself never advocated the destruction of images, several of his contemporaries adopted more radical positions than him. Two other Czech preachers, Jakub of Kaplice and a lesser-known figure named Ondřej, were also compelled in 1389 to publicly recant their views on images. Jakub's preaching had been particularly confrontational. He declared that the relics should neither be decorated nor worshipped, arguing that their miraculous nature was merely an illusion. He went so far as to claim that, quote, nothing would happen if they were thrown into fire or stamped upon, end of quote. The investigation records reveal that he had also verbally abused a statue of Virgin Mary, declaring that he would like to use it to cook peas, and even made vulgar gestures in front of it. It is perhaps not so surprising, therefore, that he was suspended from preaching for 10 years. I do not claim there is a direct link between Lipman and Maciej of Janov, although it is noteworthy that the sermons of some Reform preachers in Prague allegedly attracted members of the Jewish community, as we have heard, and Maciej, like his more radical fellow preachers, Jakub and Ondřej, preached in the Old Town Church of St. Nicholas, just outside of the Jewish quarter. However, Lipman systematically referred to ideas and terminology associated with Christian Reform discourse. As we have seen, like Maciej, Lipman criticized Christians who claim that divinity is in some form present in the miraculous images and statues of Jesus and saints. This suggests a conscious effort to present Jewish objections to image worship as a legitimate opinion that could resonate with Christians as well. Lipman went even further than Maciej, however, in suggesting that even those Christians who venerate images as a likeness or a remembrance are transgressing the biblical prohibition. In Sefer HaNitzachon, Lipman recorded another significant polemical discussion with the Franciscan theologian Marquard von Lindau. Since Marquard died in 1392, this encounter must have taken place before the disputation with Peter. In his literary representation of both debates in Sefer HaNitzachon, however, Lipman focused on similar issues, namely Jewish and Christian liturgy, and used the terminology that again resonated with the concerns of Bohemian Reform preachers. According to Lipman's account, Marquard criticized Jewish attitudes towards Christian worship. He accused the Jews of ridiculing Christian liturgical songs, comparing their mockery to the biblical episode where Michal, King David's wife, criticized David for dancing during worship. Lipman countered this claim by pointing to the problematic nature of Christian worship. Quote, "It is true that we find it amusing that you place images in front of you and cry out in a great voice, but they do not hear you. For most of you direct your prayers toward the images. Even those who say that they venerate the images only as a likeness and remembrance are not justified in doing so because it is a cause of error." In both debates with Marquard and with Peter Pesach, Lipman framed potentially controversial Jewish traditions as theological statements rather than as expressions of religious hostility. In doing so, he provided his readers with an effective strategy for engaging in such polemical situations. Moreover, we have seen that Lipman's argument drew on a familiar Christian distinction between educated and uneducated approaches to religious images. He presented Jews as members of the educated urban elite who, unlike the uneducated villagers, fully understood why image worship was theologically problematic. This rhetorical strategy was efficient in two ways. First, it improved the Jewish community's standing with Christian reformers, but it also challenged common medieval stereotypes. These stereotypes, found especially in medieval parodies such as Peasant Catechism, a short mock grammar written by a Viennese bachelor, Georg Prentberger, had portrayed the Jews as simple-minded and stubborn, much like peasants. This association between Jews and peasants appeared in other contemporary sources as well. In astrological texts, Both groups were associated with the rule of the planet Saturn. This connection was well known to scholars residing in Prague. To name one example, the astronomer Christian of Prachatice, who served as a parish priest of the wealthy St. Michael's Church in the Old Town, as well, and was Jan Hus's patron at the Prague University, mentioned Saturn's rule over both groups in one of his replies as a matter of fact. In conclusion, the polemical strategies employed by Jewish scholars in Prague during the late 14th and early 15th centuries reveal their engagement with both internal religious discussions and the broader Christian theological debates of the time. The activities of figures like Avigdor Kara and Yom Tov Lipman Mu resonated with the concerns of Christian religious reformers regarding contemporary religious practice. By offering a reinterpretation of Jewish faith grounded in philosophically informed understanding of traditional Jewish texts, these authors not only engaged polemically with the majority society, but also reinforced the religious identity of their own community. Rather than suggesting direct influence between Jewish and Christian theologians and precursors of the Hussites, I have aimed to demonstrate that Jews and Christians, while sharing physical space and engaging in complex social interactions, also participated in a broader discourse, in a common broader discourse on religious belief and practice in a nuanced way. I have listed some further reading for those of you who might be interested to read more details. I have skipped quite a lot, so feel free to read up. I thank you very much for your attention and welcome any questions that you might have.